What's up, everybody? Welcome into this week's start sit video at the wide receiver position. Clearly, I'm not Justin. He's on vacation, so I'm filling in this week, and I have 4 players that I want to highlight as specific start sits this week at wide receiver. And first up, I want to put my seal of approval and vote of confidence on Saints wide receiver Chris Olave, who actually has a great matchup this week against the Las Vegas Raiders, who have been horrible, absolutely horrible against opposing quarterbacks, which I actually really do like Andy Dalton this week too as a streamer if you needed a quarterback. But the Vegas Raiders have allowed good wide receivers to have great fantasy days against them. Both Cortland Sutton and Jerry Jeudy had 15 plus fantasy points each that week. Hollywood and Greg Dortch combined for 27 fantasy points. Marquez Valdes-Scantling even had 15 points without scoring a touchdown because Kelsey just caught all 4 of them that week. So when you take a defense that allows that kind of production and then you combine it with a receiver in Chris Olave, who's uber talented and hasn't scored fewer than 15 fantasy points since week 2, without Michael Thomas, without Jarvis Landry, I think we're in for a big game this week. Olave is probably in most everybody's lineups out there, unless your team is like insanely stacked at the wide receiver position. So maybe this just isn't all that helpful to a lot of you out there, but I just wanted to emphasize my confidence in starting him this week. And honestly, what might be the final week where his dynasty price is somewhat reasonable to acquire. So go out and try to acquire Chris Olave. If you have Olave on your team, throw him in your starting lineup with tons of confidence this week. Next up on this list is my dude Wan'Dale Robinson, who is now the unquestioned wide receiver 1 in New York. And in his first game playing over 25% of snaps last week, Robinson saw 8 targets, catching 6 of those for 50 yards. Now, we know Daniel Bellinger is out. Kadarius Toney is shipped out of town. Not that he really mattered anyway. He wasn't playing. But then they also get the Seattle Seahawks, who have allowed some big games to opposing wide receivers, including 20-point weeks to Jerry Jeudy, Josh Reynolds, and Mike Williams, plus 15-point weeks to Chris Olave, Deebo Samuel, and Drake London. And I think the floor here is basically what he did last week as a hyper-targeted PPR fantasy producer, with the upside of possibly catching a touchdown or just like an obscene number of passes to get to 18, 19, 20 fantasy points without scoring a touchdown. And I would play him over guys like Darnell Mooney, Romeo Doubs, Isaiah McKenzie, Chase Claypool. I just think that Wan'Dale deserves to be in your starting lineups if you have him. And I also think that Darius Slayton is also a solid play this week too, around the same tier as Wan'Dale, with his big playability if you really needed that home run swing. The third guy on this list is Jets receiver Garrett Wilson, who honestly has had a terrible month of October with 4 straight weeks under 6.5 fantasy points, and now gets the New England Patriots, who are honestly a tough matchup, but they're not entirely unbeatable. And so I think that Wilson is actually in for a really nice game this week for fantasy. I don't think it's a coincidence that Wilson's fantasy struggles coincided with Breece Hall's explosion, and the Jets have been able to just rely on Hall to win games. But now, Breece Hall isn't there, and like I mentioned in the running backs video, I don't think Michael Carter and James Robinson are going to be able to get it done on the ground against New England. So I believe that the Jets are going to have to throw more in order to win, like what they had to do whenever Wilson was breaking out to start the year. I'm also believing that Corey Davis isn't going to play this week after hurting his knee last week and not practicing at all on Wednesday. So an increase in passing volume plus Corey Davis out and Elijah Moore doing his thing, requesting a trade and all of that could equal a good fantasy day for Garrett Wilson. And like I said, the Pats haven't been completely unbeatable through the air. I mean, both Dolphins receivers had top 20 weeks against them in the same week. Both Packers receivers in Lazard and Romeo Doubs had top 20 weeks in that same week. Josh Reynolds had a top 20 week. Amari Cooper scored 14 points against them just 2 weeks ago. If you've been benching Garrett Wilson to this point, I think it's time to dust him off and plug him in this week as a solid flex option. And the final guy that I want to talk about this week is Jaguars receiver Christian Kirk, who is playing against the Denver Broncos in London. And I'll be honest, I think Kirk is a sit this week. I mean, London games themselves are really weird, and no, the Broncos have not been great, but their defense is not the issue, especially when it comes to Patrick Surtain. Next Gen Stats actually have Patrick Surtain as a top 3 shutdown corner in the league, and that shows when you look at the box score, when you see DK Metcalf and Tyler Lockett having bad fantasy weeks, Brandon Cooks, Brandon Ayuk, Michael Pittman, Mike Williams. The only player who's really done anything against Denver has been Davante Adams, because, I mean, it's Davante Adams. So if Surtain is covering Kirk for more than half the game, I think Kirk is going to have a hard time. Let's not forget that before last week, Kirk has also been having major issues for fantasy this month too, being saved by 1 touchdown to prevent 3 straight weeks under 8 fantasy points. The ceiling, of course, is always there for an explosive player like Kirk, but the floor, especially this week, covered by Patrick Surtain, can be really, really low, like 5, 6, 7 fantasy points low. So I'm comfortable taking Kirk out of my starting lineup this week for someone with either a higher floor, maybe like Wan'Dale Robinson, or a better chance at hitting his ceiling this week than Christian Kirk. Just make sure that if you do pull him, that you do that before early Sunday morning, because like I said, they do play in London. So those are the 4 wide receivers that I specifically wanted to highlight. And if you have any start sit questions, go ahead and throw them down in the comments and we'll get back to you before the games start on Sunday. And then be sure to check out the video on running backs this week too, if you haven't already.